Jesus lived for a time with the Essenes. His time spent with the Essenes was low-keyed and relaxed. Days were spent fishing along the Jordan River and studying animal behavior in the fields around the homes. Animals have stayed true to nature in their behavior, and as a result of the time Jesus spent in this manner, he was able to use animals in many of his teachings. Chapter 6. The Jordan River. Jesus was walking along a dusty lane in his bare feet one day with a fishing pole over his shoulder and his dog beside him. They came to a puddle on the side of the road and sat down to dig out some earthworms. Several more boys came upon them and stopped to help him. As they pulled the worms out of the slime, Jesus couldn't help but compare this with what he knew humanity needed, pulled out of the slime, but not to meet the same fate the fishing worms would have. He knew humanity needed to have a goal to want to stay out of the slime. He also knew that those pulling them out of the slime had to be a personification of that goal. In other words, set an example. He suddenly realized that this was what his life must be. He wasn't very old at the time, but had this terrific insight into his purpose even then. The same is true today. Servers must be role models for those less fortunate. There was a swamp near the Jordan, an area quite large in size, where the ground was always damp and the cattails grew profusely. Jesus used to play here. He would roll up his pant legs and remove his sandals and wade in the swamp and watch different bugs and insects and pick cattails and study other forms of growth. He would compare this in his mind, this swamp, with the dry, dusty hills a little ways away from the river, and wonder at the immense difference in the two areas that were geographically so close together. Then he would apply this contrast to people he knew, married couples or parents and children, those who were close, and he would realize that this could and did happen in families. One of them could be like the swamp, wet and green and fruitful, and the other one dry and dusty and barren. These two areas, or people, could be side by side for a long time and no one would realize it until one day someone went from one area to the other and realized that there was a difference. After feeling the refreshing, fruitful green swamp area, the dry, dusty, barren hills were hard to take as reality. Jesus used this illustration later when talking to older people who wanted to follow him and believe in his teachings, but were held back by their families, such as Ruth, if you're familiar with her story. But he also cautioned them that someone had to inhabit the dry, barren areas, and by their very presence make that area more livable. Everyone couldn't live in the swamp, but what they could do was carry memories of the green, wet area with them, and by irrigation and husbandry try to make the barren area acceptable. Jesus loved to swim. He and a group of friends went every day to the Jordan and swam and played in the water and along the banks. His friends all admired his ability to stay underwater for longer periods of time than any of them could. Even as a youngster, he had control of his mental processes. One day while swimming, he played a trick on them by swimming downstream around a bend out of sight, and then got out of the water and circled back around behind them on land. By the time he got back, they were frantic and were all diving underwater looking for him. Some were crying and wailing. One took off to go tell his parents. Jesus didn't realize what a mean thing this was to do until he saw their reaction. He learned a lesson from this, that pranks can be carried too far. He gathered them all around him and asked their forgiveness, but also used the occasion for good by telling them that they should not fear death. He told them what it would be like when they did die and eased their fears. When his mother and father arrived, they were all sitting in a circle with their eyes on Jesus as he was describing the wonders in store for them. He was severely chastised and punished for his misdeed. You see, he had to learn lessons like all of humanity. These years were all spent learning one lesson after another. He turned that bad experience into one with a more positive attitude by taking advantage of an opportunity to tell the children about death. This is a lesson that all humanity could benefit from today. The stars were shining brightly one night in Nazareth. Jesus and a group of friends were night fishing in the Jordan. One of the young men with him became ill and slipped into the water. He had actually fainted, and as the others reached for him, he slipped deeper into the water and away from their grasp into the swift current. The rocks were sticking up all around, and Jesus realized that someone had to go after him and help him, or he would be lost forever. He wasted no time and jumped in after his friend. He soon realized this was a mistake. Now he was in deep trouble, and there were two of them needing to have help. He shouted to the others to run along the bank downstream to a spot where a sandbar protruded into the water and wait for them to float by there. The friends did this and grabbed the first lad that went by. They tried to revive him, but in trying to stop Jesus, who was getting near, they had to stop their efforts on the first in order to save the second, who could save the first if he were saved. This was their decision, and they left the first one, and all hands pulled Jesus ashore, who immediately revived the first lad. They were all cold, wet, hungry, tired, and scared when it was all over. They hugged each other close in sheer relief that the event had ended so well, and none were seriously the worse for any of it. Each had learned a valuable lesson, but not all learned the same lesson. Jesus spent one whole day fishing, from early morning till the last light of day. They needed to have the fish to eat for their evening meal, and he caught nothing. As he was leaving the riverbank, very depressed and upset, he came upon a bucket of fish and some poles and other equipment with no one around them watching them. He just couldn't go home and face Mary. He was about 16 at this time. He picked up the bucket of fish and took them home. The whole family ate the meal and enjoyed it, but later that night Jesus got ill, very ill, vomiting the contents of his stomach over and over. He knew that taking the fish was wrong. He also knew that he couldn't bring them back in the form he had found them in, but was trying to bring them back anyway by vomiting them up in a different form. He knew this new form was unacceptable to be offered as a replacement for what he stole, and he really was in a quandary. To add to it, he didn't know whom he had stolen them from in the first place. He never slept all night. His mind was whirling, first thinking how to locate the original owner, and finally by dawn realizing that this was something that he could tell no one, that he would have to live out his days with this on his conscience until he could find it in himself, the God within himself, to forgive himself. He had only the best of intentions at the time he committed the act against universal law, and this helped him accept the deed somewhat. He knew he had done it so as not to disappoint his family and also to feed them necessary food. At the same time, he knew he had taken food from another one, but rationalized that this one was having better luck with his fishing and that perhaps he could replace what was taken. Jesus could not eat fish ever again after that without getting a sick feeling upon ingesting them. He eventually gave up trying to eat fish. He was a long time bringing forgiveness of himself up out of his inner being, but finally managed to understand that it had been a very necessary lesson for the growth of his soul.